So today I wanted to talk about something I recalled when thinking about this old Sherlock Holmes story. It's in the first ever published Sherlock Holmes story. I like to revisit these every fall, every winter. And in A Study of Scarlet, Sherlock Holmes describes his mind as an attic. And I thought this was very interesting, especially when you get to the BBC show Sherlock, which came out probably over 10 years ago now, but was very popular. And Sherlock, in that adaptation, modernization, changes it from an attic to a hard drive.
This is my hard drive, and it only makes sense to put things in there that are useful. Really useful. Ordinary people fill their heads with all kinds of rubbish, and that makes it hard to get at the stuff that matters.
And I thought that was a very interesting decision to make that change that is quite indicative of where we have come in the last 120 years since this was first published. Looking at that initial metaphor that Doyle uses, I consider that a man's brain originally is like a little empty attic. Not a library, not a filing cabinet, not somewhere where you would traditionally store knowledge, but an attic. And it evokes a certain feeling of dustiness, things that you don't really need to look at all that often, and yet incredibly personal. Often we keep our most personal things in the attic, things from our childhood, prized possessions that we don't use every day, and yet we don't want to throw away. And of course, for Holmes, these are things he keeps in his head rather than writes down. And what are some of the things that we keep in our attics? And perhaps he says attic because it's at the top of the human body, just like an attic is at the top of a house. Maybe it's that simple. But he says a fool takes in all the lumber of every sort that he comes across, so that the knowledge which might be useful to him gets crowded out, or at best is jumbled up with a lot of other things, so that he has a difficulty in laying his hands upon it. And what could be more true today? Even if we've replaced our attics with hard drives that can store in a very small amount of space really quite a lot of information, and yet how much of it are we able to access? How often are we able to find the really useful pieces of knowledge or information amongst all of the other crap? When we think about knowledge management today, people use tools like Obsidian, Evernote, things that allow this, cross-directional linking as this great tool to maintain knowledge. Of course, I've got videos on keeping an analog Zettelkasten, and the parallels between Zettelkasten to something like Obsidian and the mind as an attic to the mind as a hard drive are quite apparent, I think. A hard drive just lets you keep oodles and noodles and poodles of information, whereas my Zettelkasten has a physical box. There's only so many notes that will fit in it, and of course you can expand it, but just this idea that there is only so much space, there's something to that. What happens when your attic overflows? You start stacking ideas in front of the door. It becomes difficult to get out, difficult to get in. Again, more difficulty finding things. Things cannot have a proper home because there's too many things for the real estate of the attic. And so, what's so interesting in the story is, Holmes is describing his mind this way to Watson. And Watson says, "But the solar system." And Sherlock says, "What the deuce is it to me?" He interrupted impatiently. "You say that we go round the sun. If we went round the moon, it would not make a pennyworth of difference to me or to my work." And then Watson decides he shouldn't question Sherlock further. And I think we don't use this perspective enough that Sherlock is espousing here. Selective ignorance. Of course, it's great to know that we live in a heliocentric solar system, right? That we go around the sun, as opposed to geocentric. We corrected that paradigm. But what difference does that make to your daily life? And yet that's something you store up here. Now, of course, these grand ideas about how the world works are helpful. But what are we filling our minds with every day on our phones, listening to the news, watching the news, cable news? I often find that the news has absolutely nothing to do with me. These days we get information from so far away. What has some terrible event in another country even got to do with my daily life? And yet it sits up here, and depending on the tragedy, might weigh on me for quite some time. We've gotten so used to learning about these things that we feel like we have to know about them. But I question whether that's really the case. Local news obviously can affect us so much more, and so perhaps it's worth limiting our exposure to that, because all this other news is potentially taking up space that could be used for more contemplative practices. When we think of our mind like a hard drive, like in the BBC's Sherlock, as opposed to an attic, we're assuming that our knowledge can be searchable, not livable, that our memory should be perfect, not personal. And I'm not sure that that's better. The lovely thing about an attic, if you have a childhood home that's still in the family and the attic is still full of the things of your childhood, what joy is it to perhaps go through that and get rid of the cobwebs and see your homework from 3rd grade, or a story you wrote, or a drawing you made, or an old photograph of your grandparents, perhaps. And the dust and the lighting is all part of that atmosphere. But a hard drive doesn't contain any of that. It's just pure information. And something is lost there. And perhaps this limited space of the attic, which enables some measure of forgetting. I've got to bring in something new that's valuable, which necessitates getting rid of something old. Perhaps this forgetting is actually necessary for true wisdom, for this more than knowledge, but actual wisdom that you may seek. And I want to bring in the notebook into the conversation here, because I think the notebook acts as a third space, a sort of external place that works with your attic. Especially an old notebook. You reopen an old notebook, and there are memories that live in there. They're like storage units instead of your attic, perhaps. And they can be more like living documents than mere archives, since they store this and they actually contain the texture of the time you used them. Whereas again, these digital notebooks simply don't retain any of that information. It's slower than digital memory, and that often means that, again, you may lose something in the process. But that slowness is valuable because in the losing, you're getting rid of what is perhaps extraneous and focusing on the absolute essential of the idea or the memory that you're writing down. So it's a short video this week. I'm still experimenting with how I'm structuring these videos and what I'm talking about, but I thought I'd leave you again with some journal prompts. If your mind were an attic, what would it look like right now? Cluttered, empty, organized, dusty, full of boxes you're afraid to open, perhaps? What kinds of thoughts take up the most space in your attic? What mental furniture has been in there the longest? Do they need to be thrown out and make room for something new? What's in the farthest corner of your attic? How might you renovate it? If you could add light to open windows, rearrange the shelves, maybe organize things and find connections that weren't there before. When you write something down, are you simply storing it or transforming the very idea itself? How do the limits of pages, help keep your attic in order? Let me know in the comments if you found this useful. And if not, I hope you promptly remove anything you've learned from this video from your attic. Until next time.